Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack, back again to start talking about how much does the meta matter for you, alright? This video, I really wanted to angle towards people who are on the fence about re-rolling, who are in, say, heroic to slash mythic guilds. They're feeling that pressure from officers, from friends, to re-roll to something new, because that tier list said it was meta, because that stream I watched said it was really good, or that log I was looking at showed them at the top. I wanted to talk about that because it's one of the pretty much most asked questions I've seen so far, and especially with my roots in playing Holy and Disc Priest, a lot of Holy Priests feeling the pressure to go Disc when sometimes they're not really the most comfortable with it. So I wanted to start showing some of the criteria for my recommendations for when is it important for somebody to potentially reroll to something, when is it not, depending on the level of progression that you're playing at, and depending on the content that you're going to be playing at as well. So very important to note, Castle Nathria is going to be the new raid of the expansion, the first raid of the expansion, and looking at how a spec performs in the raid is always crazy important to determining, okay, well, do we need to have a paladin, a shaman, a whatever to be able to be successful, or are we just shooting ourselves in the foot? This also holds true for various DPS specs, as we saw in Nyalotha, for example. Having more mages, even if your mages weren't great players, would just be easy mode. It would just substantially do more damage than a lot of other specs just because of how powerful that they were whenever you gave every little piece of borrowed power stacked on top, right? So, what is Castle Nathria going to be really looking like here? To me, I don't actually think that the Castle Nathria is going to be as stringent for the average mythic raiding guild in terms of what spec that you want to bring. Obviously, every single top-end guild, the very best of the business, the world-first guilds, are going to squeeze every little drop they can out of every spec and then make sure that they're bringing everything perfect, right? But for the average mythic guild, I don't believe Castle Nathria is going to be as extreme in their meta requirements. And you might say, well, what does that mean? I mean, it's going to be more similar to Uldir than it will than it will be to Eternal Palace, right? In Uldir, there was a lot more steady, consistent damage that was coming out, and a lot of times, yes, there was value in damage reduction, yes, there was value in healer damage, but those things didn't determine whether or not you were going to be absolutely killing the boss or not. A lot of times it was, can you sustain, can you attrition heal through this damage, and can you get everybody to that finish line? And in the case of their DPS, can you do some priority damage on the Plague Amalgams when you needed to? In our case, sometimes yes. So, looking at a fight like this, we were very much helped by, well, one, this just having way higher throughput than it had any right to have, but also, Rested Druids throughout Uldir had such strong HPS through so many different periods of this because the damage was more steady, it was more consistent, and it was very easy to be able to capitalize on like a 2-minute trank and how powerful it was because there was just constant damage events going on all the time, no matter what. When you look at a raid like Eternal Palace, it is pretty much one of the most standout raids for being terrible for healer balance. As a result of this, healer balance got set back very significantly throughout this raid because you had a variety of encounters like Lady Ashvane or the Hatchery or even Lady Ashara herself that put massive pressure on everybody, more casual mythic guilds and the hardest of hardcore alike, to reroll to certain specs to be able to make your lives easier. When you look at even Queen's Court, like I mentioned a couple times with Ashara, making sure you had that damage reduction would literally be the difference between life or death for a lot of your raiders. Yes, a lot more casual mythic guilds are going to have additional HP, additional gear, things like that. But when you have the defensive level of players being so low relative to the damage that's incoming, yeah, you might have 5% more HP or something like that, but not having the 20% damage reduction, the 25% at a barrier or something like that, the health redirect and the 10% at a spirit link in some cases, it would just mean the end of your raid team in a lot of cases, and it would make it so that everybody would have to play even better to get that job done. So, when it comes to getting yourself ready for Shadowlands, where do we start looking at some of those fights as, is this an outlier where I need to have overwhelming amounts of throughput? And in my experience and through testing every single one of the Castle Nathria bosses, I didn't really see that. You know, you'll see a fight like Sludge Fist, for example, draw parallels to Lady Ashvane, where it's just debuffs on debuff stacking up that you had to be dealing with. But there's also other mechanics. You have to follow, for example, something similar to like what we saw at Una, where you have to kind of connect yourself to other players. You got to be running around with them. There's other factors and mechanics that are around to sort of keep you busy, rather than it just being a pure DPS, HPS race that's going to come into it. And don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to say that damage reduction or healer damage are not valuable, but my whole point is they have greater or lesser value relative to HPS, relative to healing, just having a lot of oomph, right? They have greater or lesser value depending on the content that you're doing, right? So if you have a raid, if you have an encounter like we saw out of Eternal Palace, it becomes more important to have healer damage and damage reduction. If you're in fights like the beginning of the expansion with Uldir, and in my opinion for Castle Nathria, it starts becoming less important for those setups. So what can you do to be able to best help yourself be that asset if you're not being pushed to reroll? Or in my opinion, I would not push a lot of healers to reroll unless your entire healer roster was just the same healer. Like you had 4 Resto Shamans or 5 Resto Druids or 4 Holy Priests or whatever. You know, as long as you don't have a roster like that, I would say the biggest thing you could do is make sure you have a diverse roster and make sure that you're putting the time, effort, and work into studying a lot of these encounters. Because the difference maker for a lot of these encounters, and it was very, very heavily emphasized in Uldir as well as Battle for Dazar'alor, was you have a number of fights where there would be steady damage coming out, but it would also be much more of an attrition encounter. And what I mean by that is fights would stretch on for long periods of time, where healers especially would have to be able to stretch out the resources, but they'd also have to make sure that they were going to be reducing their own damage taken and their own pressure that they had on themselves so that they'd afford to be able to heal everybody else as the fight started getting more and more hectic at the very end, you know? Think about, you know, like Link's Awakening back in the day. You hit the snake's tail or something like that, it starts spazzing out and going faster, and then going faster, and then going faster until it's all over the place, and that's where you start taking the unavoidable hits, but that's where you need to have a large reservoir of health, or in this case, large reservoir of mana at your disposal to be able to survive, to be able to keep others alive, and make sure that you can kill that boss fight, right? That is what we're going to be seeing at Nathria, and that's why it's so important for healers to not only learn and practice and be able to execute as the throughput demands, but also to be working to improve their own performance in the raid just to make sure they're taking less overall damage, which is something which is pretty much an ongoing fight for healers. It's an ongoing bit of education, a bit of learning that's always going to be with you for very long periods of time, because it can be a challenge. Quite honestly, it can be a challenge and it can be a struggle when, yeah, you're able to heal yourself. You're able to immediately make up for that mistake or make up for that error when you've taken additional damage. But there's always that temptation to, hey, let me just drop some extra healing, or let me just stand in this zone a little bit longer. Let me stand in fire because I can immediately make up for it, and I know I won't die to this thing. But the opportunity cost is you're going to be less safe when damage goes out onto other players, when you consume too many of your resources early on in encounters, and then you're just gonna go 2-minute And yeah, you'll look great in the early progression or something along those lines. You'll look all great and happy inside when you're topping meters every wipe. But then as the fight progresses, if you're not controlling your own damage taken, if you're not controlling your resource expenditure, that's one of the biggest things that I've had to learn over the years, is that you're going to do more harm than good as a result if you don't start learning that as you go on. If you guys got any questions, feel free to hit me up. Like I mentioned, the meta and when it comes to how best you want to be able to help your raid team is so much more on working to optimize your gameplay as a raider, more so than picking the lottery and making sure that you play Flavor of the Month and whatever the world first raiders are playing as. Focus on your own gameplay, regardless of the spec that you're in, and you'll continue to be able to rise through the ranks. And don't believe me? Well, we got another video coming up. It's going to talk about my history in WoW and how I came up through raiding, playing Holy Priest and Warlords of Draenor when nobody wanted to bring a Holy Priest to the environment, all right? Everyone is able to do it. You're always going to be able to rise through the ranks as whatever spec you are. I played with Feral Druids and Enhancement Shamans in areas where they were just quite terrible. Quite honestly, they were just quite terrible, but those players were excellent, and those players progressed higher, got into better guilds, and were brought on the roster consistently because their performance was so strong. Because they lived, they did mechanics, they studied, they reduced their damage taken. All of these things are absolutely key core components to being an excellent raider, and something that will always start getting you into raid spots. Thanks so much for watching, guys. I hope you all enjoyed it, and let me know if you have any other sort of questions. Stay cozy, my friends.